up there. Anything I say outside of Mark 14 is going to show up on the screen behind me, and then anything within that chapter, make sure you have your own Bible, write in it, mark it up. It's good to have. I was thinking through this sermon, and I realized that it says something about temptation. I believe that most of us think that we're somewhat strong enough to endure some kind of temptation, right? Like we can do it. We're strong enough. But I always find myself on the other side of that, like believing that I'm strong enough to overcome something, and then finding myself completely unable to, where the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. You guys feel like that? And I think there's something to be said about that in this text. I just want you guys to kind of question, how do we overcome temptation? Because the thing is, temptation is not something that we're ever going to be able to avoid. The question is not like if you are tempted, it's always when you are going to be tempted, right? When you are going to go through a time of distress and trouble, when are you going to go through a time of anxiety? Because it's never if, it's always when. When are you going to have anxiety? When are you going to be distressed? When are you going to go through temptation? How are you going to deal with that? And I think that's a question that we kind of think about as we go through Scripture. How is it that we're supposed to overcome these things? I think there's like this inner thought that says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I feel that. And then the moment of temptation, the moment of distress, the moment of anxiety comes, and I find out like the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. I believe I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, and I find myself utterly failing, right? That's where I believe a lot of us are, knowing that we should be filled with the Spirit, able to overcome things, and yet desperately in need of help, right? How do we overcome that kind of temptation? Some people may think, well, overcoming temptation is easy. C.S. Lewis said this, and I think it's an important quote, so just listen to it. He says, "No man knows how bad he is until he's tried very hard to be good." You guys get what he's saying? No one knows how hard it is to say no to cheesecake until you have cheesecake right in front of you. And then you know how difficult it is to say no to that cheesecake. No one knows how hard it is to be good. Let me read this again. No one knows how bad he is until he's tried very hard to be good. Yeah, there's something to be said there. I try really hard. Maybe something like what Paul says in Romans 7, right? I know the good that I ought to do, and that is the very thing I find myself not doing. And I know the things that I shouldn't be doing, and that is the very thing that I find myself doing. And Paul ends it by saying, what a wretched person am I. In fact, let's read something from Paul as he says that. In that text, Romans chapter 7, verse 21, he says this about what the law that's going on inside of him. He says, so I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. See, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Evil's right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my own mind and making me a prisoner to the law of sin at work within me. That's me. I know the good I ought to do, and I find myself not doing it, right? The spirit is willing, and the flesh is weak. Often I think, though, that we think we can overcome these trials. And I don't know how strong we are. The spirit's willing, the flesh is weak. I'll give you a couple examples. In Mark 14, Jesus is talking to the disciples, and this is right before verse 32. He's talking to the disciples, and he tells them in verse 27, if you're looking at it, Jesus tells the disciples this, you will fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. So Jesus knew it. He's like, you're going to fall away. And then in verse 30, verse 29, Peter declares, even if all fall away, I will not. See, Peter thought he was strong enough. Even if all fall away, I won't. I think Peter's going to do on that. Right? Even if all fall away, I won't. And then Peter's so sure of himself that in verse 31, we find that Peter again insists emphatically, even if I die with you, I will never disown you. And then like a mighty chorus, everybody else around Peter says the same thing. I will do the same, right? They all believe that they're going to be strong enough to endure temptation. They all believe that they're going to be strong enough when that hour comes to remain faithful. But I'm telling you, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, right? In fact, all of them will fall away. We're going to be going through Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, but I want to show you how the story turns out before we actually look at the story. See, starting with Peter and what he said, I will never disown you. Well, let's see how that works out. In Mark chapter 14, in verse 41, look at it. It says, returning a third time, he said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. The hour is come. Look, the Son of Man is being delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let's go. Here comes my betrayer. Were they ready? No. See what happens in verse 50? Then everyone deserted him and fled. That's the disciples. They believe that they're strong enough to overcome that hour of temptation. And when Jesus shows up and says, the hour has come, they all take off running. But what was it? Why is it that Jesus, when he encounters that hour of temptation, he boldly goes out courageously and says, let's meet my betrayer, and the disciples take off running? What is the difference between those disciples who can't seem to rise and meet the challenge of the hour of distress, the hour of temptation, and Jesus who stands boldly before it? Now, the easy option would to say, well, it's because Jesus is truly God, right? But that kind of undervalues the humanity of Jesus. Although Jesus was truly God, he's also truly man. He was tempted like us in every way. And to say that it wasn't hard for him is to lower that humanity in some sense. Jesus went through what we went through, yet he did it without sin. So I wonder, what is it that makes Jesus victorious on the hour of temptation, and the disciples run away in fear in the hour of temptation? The reason I wonder this is because I really think it's something for us. If we want to be able to stand against that hour, when that time of trial comes, when we go through moments of anxiety and stress, and we want to stay faithful to God, I think in this story we're going to find the key to that. We're going to find out what it is that Jesus does to prepare himself versus what it is that the disciples do to prepare themselves. And I believe what we'll find is a key or a strategy to be successful when we encounter trials. Because again, it's not if you will encounter trials. It's not if you'll go through anxiety. It's not if you'll come across some kind of distress. It's when you come across distress, when you go through temptation. How are you going to overcome it? And I think there's some keys to it. So let's look what Jesus does, because Jesus does some things that I think helps prepare him for that hour of distress. Looking at verse 32, it says this, they went to the place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed to sorrow to the point of death, he said. Stay here and keep watch. So this is right after all the disciples said, even if all of them turn away, that's Peter's words, right? Even if all turn away, I will never leave you. And then they go to this Garden of Gethsemane, which the word means olive press. And most likely there was some kind of olive press there. And how you press olives is you crush them up, and then you squeeze them tight, and all the water and the oil comes together, and then that separates. And then you take the oil off top, right? But they go to Gethsemane, and Jesus takes 3 of his closest companions, Peter, James, and John, the ones that have gotten special access to Jesus throughout the Gospel of Mark. They got to see Jesus raise Jairus, his daughter, the synagogue leader. They got to hear God speak from the mountain, this is my son whom I love, with him I'm well pleased. And now they get to see Jesus in his greatest moment of distress. And how does Jesus overcome that? Do you notice that he acknowledges how he's feeling? He takes 3 of his closest companions. They're all going to let him down. But 3 of his closest companions, and he says to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. I think we should stop here and just put a pin in it for a second. Recognize that when Jesus is about to face the hour of trial, he doesn't do it alone. Right? One of the things that I think should be pointed out is the disciples say, I am strong enough. I can do it. I will never disown you, Jesus. And when it comes time to prepare for that hour, Jesus says, I can't do it alone. I need my 3 guys. Now, they're going to let him down, but he brings people with him. You cannot overcome that hour of distress if you try to do it on your own. You need community. You need people with you that you can be vulnerable with, right? Now, let me say, Jesus picks these 3. He's not vulnerable with everybody. He picks 3 special people, and he says, this is how I'm feeling. And listen to how he's feeling. My soul is overwhelmed to the point of death. That's what Jesus says to them. He says, this is how I'm feeling. This is what I'm going through. And he's inviting those 3 disciples to watch, to take part in what he's going through. They got to see it. In fact, that's Jesus' only command to them. He just says, sit here and keep watch with me. He's asking them to share in that distress. Just watch what he's going through. You can't face that hour of temptation without bringing people alongside of you and being vulnerable enough to tell them what's going on in your life. That's how Jesus prepares for the hour of temptation. He goes further, though. Not only does he acknowledge how he's feeling to the people around him, in verse 35 it says, going a little further, he fell to the ground and he prayed that if it's possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. There's something else Jesus does. Do you see how first he acknowledges how he's feeling. He brings a community with him. And then he goes a little bit further and he goes to God in like earnest prayer. See, I don't think you'll be able to face that hour of temptation, that time of trial, that moment of anxiety. First, if you do it by yourself. Second, if you don't acknowledge how you're feeling. And third, if you're not willing to fall down before God in earnest prayer. Now, I don't know how they know it, but every book I read this week said that in the first century, most people prayed standing, right? So I'm just going to accept it. But Jesus doesn't pray standing. He falls face down. Kind of like David will fall face down when he's going through distress, the death of his child. Or Moses, after the people of Israel had sinned and turned to idolatry so quickly, he lays face down and he pleads with God that he will relent and not destroy the people. So the posture of prayer here is Jesus in great distress, crying out to God saying, Lord, help me. He can't do it on his own. He needs to acknowledge how he feels, and he needs to go to God and just pray earnestly. See, that's, I think, as we're thinking about what is it that makes Jesus successful in the hour of temptation, it's these things, right? And his prayer is one of confidence. It seems maybe like it's not, but listen to what he says. He says, Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. He knows that God is all powerful. Do you believe that? Like God can get him through whatever it is that he's going through. Everything is possible for you. And then he asks this, he says, take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but you will. And we see Jesus in this moment of great distress, and we wonder, like, what is it about this cup that's so hard for him? See, Jesus becomes a model for how we're supposed to live our life, and we see other people who die for their faith. Think of Stephen. He was brave as the people were about to stone him. He was brave. Paul says to be absent from the body is to be at home with the Lord, which is better by far, right? Like he's actually hoping at some point. Like he's not facing death with fear. And you might wonder, well, why is Jesus? What is it that causes him to have so much distress? And I tell you, it's the cup. Because Jesus is not just worried about the death that's in front of him. By the way, it's going to be a horrific death as we go through the next chapter. The cross is a hard way to die. But it's more than just physical death that Jesus is worried about. He's asking that God takes this cup from him. And that cup is an image of God's wrath. Right? We could read about that in Revelation where God says he's going to pour out the cup of his wrath. Right? That cup is a symbol of God's wrath. And Jesus is praying, like, take this cup from me. Because it's so much more, Jesus is in distress, so much more than the death that awaits him, but for what that death means. Mark chapter 10, verse 45 says that Jesus, he says, the Son of Man has not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom. That means his death is a death that we deserved. He's taking that punishment. Not just a physical death. He's taking the death that we deserve so that he could give his life as a ransom. Do you remember last week we talked about the Lord's Supper, and Jesus takes the cup and he says, this is the blood of the new covenant poured out for you. See, Jesus, that cup that he's praying, God, like this is so much distress. I'm struggling with it. Take this cup from me. That death is going to be the establishment of a new covenant, a better covenant. But that's going to be a horrible thing to go through for Jesus. To take the sin of the world onto himself. And that's what Paul says that he does in 1 Corinthians. Read this with me, or 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. It says this, God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus' distress is not just about the moment, the death that awaits him. It's about bearing the sin of you and me. It's about bearing the wrath of God poured out. Sounds like something to be distressed about, right? And he handles it in such an amazing way. He tells the disciples how he's feeling. He asks community. He prays to God. I know everything is possible. If it's possible, take this cup, but not my will, but yours be done. By the way, God could have taken the cup. All things are possible with God. Of course, God's wrath would have had to been poured out on us instead of on his son. And so the fact that God doesn't take that cup says something not about God's anger, but his justice and his mercy. Because God lays the punishment that we deserve on the person of Christ. That's God's will. That he would take that sin, that the transgressions, the things that we have done to oppose God, the punishment that we deserve, he would take that and put it on Jesus. And Jesus is submitting himself. When he says, not my will be done, but your will be done, Jesus is submitting himself to the will of the Father. See, I think that's important when we go through moments of distress. Sometimes they're really hard, and you might even ask, like, God, take this from me. But God isn't always going to take it from you. He might lead you through it. And I believe God does that throughout the cross. Like, God is right there with Jesus, right there leading him through it. I recognize, like, there are trials, tribulations, struggles I go through in this life, and I think, is it ever going to be easier, God? Do you guys ever ask God that question? Is it ever going to be easier? Let me answer, it's not. It's never going to be easier. You're only going to get stronger. That's the difference. So I see people that are more, they're more mature in their faith, and it seems like the distress and the trials and tribulations, they've just overcome it so much, they just don't seem to struggle in the same ways that maybe people who are younger in their faith do. And you think, well, why do they have it so easy? It's not that they have it easier. They've learned strategies in order to overcome the hour of temptation. They've learned that they can't do it by themselves. They've learned that they need to acknowledge how they're feeling. They learned that they need to go to God in a prayer of trust that says, whatever your will is, I'm willing to do it, God. That's how we get through these moments of temptation that are so hard that we don't feel like we can do it. Now, Jesus does all those things. And he goes to God and he has faith that God will deliver him. But those disciples, well, not so much. See, in verse 37, then he returned to his disciples and he found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? See, while Jesus is preparing for the hour of temptation, what are the disciples doing? They're sleeping. Now, these are the disciples that said things like, even if they all fall away, Jesus, I will never fall away. And you can't stay awake for 1 hour. That's how strong they actually are. They can't stay awake for 1 hour. Now, you might question why they can't stay awake. If you've ever been part of Passover, there's 4 cups of wine that you're supposed to drink at that dinner, and you're supposed to drink the whole thing, right? So at the very least, these disciples have had 4 cups of wine, so they might be a bit tipsy. There's a little bit of a reason why they can't stay awake, right? But even if they had 4 cups of coffee, I guarantee you their flesh was still weak. Jesus tells them what the problem is. He says, watch out and pray so that you will not fall in temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. That's the problem. That's why they struggle in the hours, because their flesh is weak. You remember in Mark chapter 10, James and John come to Jesus and say, give us the best seats when we go into the kingdom, right? Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink from the cup that I have to drink? Can you be baptized with the baptism that I must undergo? Remember what they said? We will. We can. These guys can't even stay awake, right? Yeah, they have aspirations of drinking from that same cup, and they can't even stay awake for an hour. Now think about this, just the irony of the situation. Jesus has just laid out his heart to them and said, like, my soul is so sorrowful to the point of death. Jesus has laid out his heart, and they can't even stay awake for that. Yet when they were in the boat and Jesus was sleeping, they said, do you even care? Do you even know what's going on, Jesus? But when there's a moment of real distress, they can't stay awake and pray. I think as we look at Jesus' example, we're given an example of how we can be ready on that day of temptation, on that time of trial, on that moment of distress. But when we see the disciples, we see a counter-example. We see what we shouldn't do, right? If you want a recipe for being completely unprepared at the moment of trial, act like the disciples. Believe that you're strong enough to do it on your own, like Peter, who says, even if they all fall away, I won't. Or like the other disciples who say the same thing. Or like James and John, who says, I can drink from that cup you drink, and I can be baptized. Believe you're strong enough to do it on your own. And instead of praying, just pass out. Just fall asleep. See, I think there's a counterexample in the disciples as they prepare for that hour of temptation. They can't even stay awake. Are you asleep? Could you not watch for an hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. That's what Jesus says. And he gives them a second chance, right? Verse 39 says, once more he went away and he prayed for the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. By the way, what does it mean that they had heavy eyes? Their spirit is willing, but their flesh is weak. Their eyes were heavy. They didn't know what to say to him. So instead of preparing themselves for that moment of temptation, instead of getting ready for that hour of distress, they're sleeping because their flesh is weak. And Jesus gives them one chance. He gives them a second chance, and then he gives them a third chance. Verse 41, returning the third time, he said, are you still sleeping and resting? Enough. Enough. The hour has come. See, I think if you want to know what maybe I think a big problem is in our culture, I think is complacency. That's what was going on in the disciples, right? Jesus had laid out his heart for them. My soul is troubled to the point of death, and they were so complacent that they fell asleep. And maybe as a culture, we're so complacent that we're so stuck on TV, so stuck on our phones, so stuck on whatever it is that steals our attention, and we become complacent to what is going on in the church or what is going on with Jesus. And then you think, okay, when that hour comes, I'm going to be ready. No, you won't. You won't be ready because you didn't prepare for the moment. See, I think prayer kind of works like working out. Like prayer's a muscle, right? It's spiritual muscle, but it's a muscle. You have to use it. You have to work out, right? Imagine if you thought, well, I can bench 200 pounds. No problem. How many of you think you could do that without going in and practicing for that? No, because when the hour comes for you to bench 200 pounds, if you've done nothing to prepare, that bar is going to drop on you. You're not going to be able to accomplish it. But if you work at it, you'll become stronger, and eventually you'll be able to do it. But this doesn't just work with prayer. It doesn't just make sense with working out. Imagine if you said, hey, I want to join the band. Michael, can I play on Sunday? I'd say, well, do you know how to play? If you've never played before, do you think I'll let you play on Sunday? No, you're not prepared to play on Sunday, right? You don't know the songs. You've never practiced with us. And so I would say, sure, you can play with us, but it's going to take some preparation. You have to prepare to play with us on Sunday. So start practicing. And you practice and practice and practice and practice and practice. Guess what? You'll be able to come up and play. But nobody just jumps up on stage and starts playing the guitar or the drums or the bass. That's not how it works. You have to prepare yourself for that moment, that moment when you step on stage. You have to prepare yourself to lift 200 pounds. You have to prepare yourself. Imagine a basketball player who said, well, I can play. I think I'm pretty good at playing basketball. Let me on the team, but has never practiced. Would you want that person on your team? No. And even if he was a great basketball player, if he didn't prepare each week, you probably wouldn't want him on your team either, because he wasn't ready for the moment, that game, when it happened. And here's the disciples. They believe. They're so full of themselves. I can drink the cup. I can be baptized with the baptism. I will never fall away. They all say these things, but when that moment comes, they fail. And the reason they fail is because they've never prepared themselves for the moment. Jesus tells them how. Watch and pray so that you do not fall in temptation. So we can look at Jesus' example. He acknowledges how he's feeling. He calls those closest to him and shares vulnerable. He makes himself vulnerable to those people. He goes to God in prayer. He submits to God's will. Or we could look at the disciples. They thought that just because of who they were, they would be strong enough when that moment arrived. And they found themselves wanting. They found themselves completely unprepared. See, that's what happens moving forward in Mark chapter 14. We find out, verse 43, this is the hour has come, the betrayer is here. Just as they were speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared with him with a crowd. Appearing with him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and elders. See, there's Judas, one that Jesus trusted, one that he loved, and he shows up. The betrayer is here. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas says, Rabbi, and he kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew a sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Do you notice how Jesus bravely goes out to meet Judas? That's what preparation for temptation does. It gives you the courage to face it. And Jesus bravely goes out to meet his betrayers. He allows Judas to come up and kiss him, which in the first century was a symbol of hospitality. It was a symbol of friendship. And in a dark garden, it became the symbol that identified Jesus. Maybe a symbol of betrayal. The one I kissed, that's the one. But Jesus is brave in the hour of temptation. He goes out to meet it because he prepared himself for it. The disciples, on the other hand, are not prepared. In verse 50, then everyone deserted him. Everyone deserted him. Why? They were unprepared. The spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. See, Mark ends this in verse 51. He says, a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When he seized him, he fled naked, leaving the garment behind. And there's so much written about the possible interpretations of this man. It could be just a follower of Jesus, just one of the disciples. I like the idea that it's Mark, just kind of telling something that happened to him as he was a kid. But it also speaks to the shame of running away. He ran away naked because he wasn't willing to stand or wasn't able to stand. So he runs away in shame. And I want to just stop that from happening. I want you guys to be able to be strong and courageous at that moment of distress. I want you to face those hours of temptation with bravery. And it doesn't have to be a big hour of temptation. It could be the little things in life. those little things where all of a sudden your attention is distracted and you find yourself engaging in some kind of sin. I want you guys to be strong enough to not fall into sin. But the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Now, of course, we live in a resurrected reality that we have the Holy Spirit living inside of us. But if you don't prepare yourself the way that Jesus prepared himself this night, whenever it comes, you may not be able to stand in that hour of temptation. So to stand, acknowledge how you're feeling. Go to people that you trust and be willing to make yourself vulnerable. Go to God in prayer, a prayer of faith that says, whatever this is, don't get me out of it, lead me through it. Whatever your will is, I'll do it. And stay alert, keep watch. Because that hour of temptation, it's not a matter of if it will come, it's when it will come. And you should be prepared for that. We're going to sing a song of invitation. It's number 915 in your hymnal. And if you're looking for a church family,